In a world of business complexity, execution is everything. This is JD and the Brain, where failure was not an option and performance isn't accidental. Let's get to work.
All righty, everybody. Welcome back to JD and the Brain, the practice of business where leadership theory meets operational reality. I'm Dr. T. Wiles Fowler, along with my co-host, JD Cecilia. Whoop, whoop. And before we get into today's topic, I want to share a little milestone with you. Today, we're recording from the brand new Praxis booth. It's exciting because this isn't simply a different room with a microphone. For me, it represents something much larger. Every week, we try to bridge the gap between leadership theory and what actually happens on Monday morning when people go to work. The Praxis booth symbolizes that commitment. Our hope is that these conversations will continue helping leaders think differently about people, organizations, and the responsibility we have to develop both. Over the past several weeks, we've explored the leads continuum. We discussed how leaders move from directing to educating to administering to delegating, and then ultimately as the screener providing overwatch. That series focused on how leaders lead. As we close that chapter on the leads continuum, I'd like to leave just a few final thoughts as we move our way into human resources. Leadership is not about finding one style that works. It's about developing the wisdom to know which leadership mode people need at any given moment. Great leaders don't lead from habit, they lead with intention. Over the past several episodes, we've explored 5 modes from the leads continuum. We began with the leader, do as I say. We moved to the educator, do as I say, but here's a reason why. Next came the administrator with the root word minister. This mode shifts the conversation from giving answers to asking questions. What do you need? Great administrators remove obstacles, secure resources, and help improve communication. Next, we explored the delegator. Delegation is an abandonment. It's an investment in people. It communicates trust while developing future leaders. Delegators empower others with meaningful responsibility while remaining available for coaching and accountability. Healthy organizations multiply leadership because they're willing to release responsibility instead of hoarding it. And then finally, we discussed what's probably the least understood, but perhaps the most strategic leadership mode of all, the screener. We borrowed it from JD's background, the military concept of Overwatch. They protect movement. Screeners scan the horizon for threats, remove unnecessary distractions, reduce risk, and shield their people from noise that prevents them from doing their best work. While everyone else is focused on today's mission, the screener was looking at the landscape. When these 5 leadership modes work together, they create leaders who are agile rather than rigid, leaders who know when to direct, when to teach, when to support, when to empower, and when to protect. That's the essence of the leads continuum. But leadership alone isn't enough. You could have the right leadership style and still struggle if the right people aren't in the right positions. That's why our next series is really important. We're going to move to the second floor of the CEO Stamp of Approval building. We call it the train model. Teach, review, assist, involve, and nominate. And we're going to do an episode on each of those. If leads answers the questions, how do I lead people? Then the train model answers the question, how do we place people? So that's kind of our putting a bow on the last 5 series. Now we're looking towards human resources as we move forward. And I'm going to welcome my co-host JD Cecilia, who is a world traveler. Where you been? You've been off the radar.
Yes, I had a great week last week. Got an opportunity to really see a lot more of the Mediterranean countries with Greece, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, and then around the Horn to Italy. Took a 7-day cruise, went to all those places. It was 90 degrees plus in each one of those places, so very hot. Spent a lot of time by the ship pool too, I'll tell you that right now. So anyway, just had a great experience. Happy to be back though. For me, after about 5 days, I'm ready to come home, but I suffered through the last 2 days. So yeah, just took one for the team.
Well, you're very glowing. You look like you've got some vitamin D going on there. So
Absolutely.
that's a good thing. So HR, human resources, HRM, human resources management, HRD, human resources development, SHRM, strategic human resources management. Man, there are lots of labels with this genre.
They'll probably create another one next week too. So don't memorize that list by itself.
Yeah, I got this point here about if HR isn't simply about administration, then what's its real purpose? Have you had good experiences with HR?
I've had both, Tim. I've had some where the HR was really in a support role and really understood the mission and actively recruited to bring that type of talent in specifically because it was necessary for mission. And then I had the other ones where the staff just expanded exponentially with new titles I'd never heard of before, with niche performance missions that it's like I couldn't trace it to what we were trying to do as an organization. It seemed like it was a one-off, and it seemed like it was just a growth industry. Every time I turned around, there was another division created with a derivative from the original HR mission. So yeah, I've had both examples, both experiences, and I will tell you, it's really satisfying to work in an organization where the HR really understands the mission. In other words, the objective of why this company exists, what our organization provides, what service it delivers. It's just so refreshing to see the great people come in that fill the holes to make a better organization.
Isn't HR a means to an end, not the end itself?
Absolutely. I think the pendulum swings on all these different support functions over the years. I know it makes me sound really old, but back in the 90s, I can remember, for example, IT was just starting to kind of come of its own as recent IT developments were coming along. And soon you saw a separate C-suite staff position dedicated to simply IT. And what happened initially was they were there to support operations. Like, how can we make the operation better, faster, cheaper, easier for the employee? And it worked great. But then again, it started to grow and its subdivisions started to multiply. And pretty soon, IT was one of the biggest sections of the organizations. And I'm thinking, this is the tail wagging the dog at this point, because a lot of resources went toward IT, which were diverted from operations. And so it really became kind of an unbalanced mix between support and supported. So I've seen that happen in IT, and now over the last several years, I've seen the same thing happen in HR. It's starting to grow without any restraints because nobody wants the person to say we can't do that. They're afraid of being branded something. But what I always enjoyed was when I saw a good leader, when he or she was presented with a proposal for some HR activity or acquisition, the good leader said, "Explain to me how this makes operations better. Explain to me the connection between what you're asking and how it improves our mission accomplishment or our delivery of whatever it is that we're providing." That was the mark of a good leader because they knew that resources are finite. We don't have unlimited checkbooks. And so whatever you're doing comes at a cost to something else. So I want to know what the cost of this is going to do to our operational proficiency.
So this phenomenon, this monster, be it IT or HR that has grown, to its own fiefdom, has harmed private industry as well as the public sector. You and I both worked in the government business, and you as on the GS side and me as a contractor as well. But if you think about these IT organizations or these HR organizations, they get contracts with the government and then they put in their little system, which is not aligned with what the leadership wants. Got to spend the money. So let them design something. And then somebody wakes up and goes, this is not value added. So then they bring another group in and they start doing their own thing. And then they try to build 40% into what was already there. And then they come up with 60% of their own. And then in 3 years, they're gone. And then the third group comes in. And that's where this mediocrity and this inefficiency just fall into place when it comes to government work. And certainly in
100%. And I like to always try to equate it. In our country, we like to relate everything to a sports analogy, right? I mean, because it's one that doesn't matter what industry you're in, you can still use a sports analogy. If you look at the really good teams, they recruited specifically for a need that was absent to make them a championship team. And it takes time. And so if you take a look at, like, for example, the New England Patriots, while you may or may not like them, for 20 years and several Super Bowl rings, they obviously had their HR down pretty well because they were recruiting talent to fill all, I think what's the rule, 57 on a roster. Every one of those positions was critical because you needed all of them. You had very few people, very few replacements, substitutes, etc.
And when the superstars showed up, they weren't superstars anymore.
Yeah.
They were there to fulfill a role, and you're going to like it and you're going to fulfill it, and we're going to appreciate you, but you're not going to be the central focus of attention. You're going to be like Randy Moss. God love Randy Moss. When he was younger, he was a little crazy, and the Patriots, and he was like, Roger that, sir. You know,
That's right.
yeah, like 28 touchdown catches, him and Brady that one year. They were fulfilling right position, right role, right time. What a great analogy.
Yeah, and the other one I'd like to bring to bear is the auto industry. That's
Okay.
another one where, and you worked for the auto industry, so you get it. You recruited engineers to produce something that would be better than your competitors. You didn't bring in people for the PR sake of it. You brought in people that could make your product better. And so the bulk of their talent went toward developing a better car, a better truck, et cetera, because that's what was going to make their organization solvent and competitive. Based on a niche of what HR thought we needed. It was what do we need operationally to be the best? But just off the top of my head, I can think of those two right there. But it's the same thing in, whether you're private sector or public sector, you have to fill the needs with the talent that's required to make your operational successful.
We have organizations now where this is sort of morphed into a support function conversation, which I think is good. We have organizations where support organizations don't report to operational leadership. We got CEOs out there that the HR manager and the HR VP doesn't report to them. They report to some corporate entity or dotted line to operations. No wonder there's a disconnect.
Yeah. Oh, one thing again, I learned a lot being in the military, but one of them was the organizational structure. And whenever we went into an operation, it was very clear. It was designated in writing who was supporting and who was supported. And once you got those designations, you were either the lead or the support. But it was very clear to everybody who led and who supported those who led. And I think you lose some of that, like you just said, where they should have been supporting the CEO, but they had a dotted line organizational hierarchy to somebody else. So they didn't really answer to the CEO. They kind of had their own agenda of what they were going to do. And clearly that's not a recipe for success.
For sure. And CEOs, they could care less if you think you're HRD and he's HRM and it's HRM. They could care less if, you think development's more important than management. They're just looking for results, right? They're just looking to provide me the support I need. Don't take me to Abilene, so to speak.
Yeah, when I left the government service, both from a uniform and as a government civilian, and went to work in the private sector, I found out very quickly that CEOs have three primary languages. And whatever you bring to them, if you can speak in one of their primary languages, you have their attention. And I think what happened is people forgot what those three primary languages were and they went to other things. And HR is a classic example. They forgot the three primary languages. So the first primary language that a CEO speaks fluently is money. Talk to the CEO in terms of money. They are absolutely interested. The second primary language they have is money, and the third primary language is money. So if you can take any of their three primary languages, you've got their attention. And that's where I think we lose the ball right there, is where we get off on something else that doesn't connect to the success of the organization.
So I've got 4 decades of experience just like you. I can think of one example where the HR department moved beyond just payroll and PTO and benefits packages, to my development. And that happened at Ford Motor Company when I kind of made that leap into the leadership role, executive junior kind of thing. And it was a strong partnership between the director of the Ford production system and the HR manager. In fact, that HR manager kind of took a little special interest in me from my perspective, so they had obviously got on the same page behind the scenes. They even configured my promotion around the annual merit so that it would be even a greater increase, in my income. Boy, that was a motivating factor. But the other 25 places that I worked, I don't think I ever thought about HR much at all, other than if my paycheck was wrong or something. But
Yeah.
they got those things right, So the vision of the book is that executive leadership and HR are what I call a dyad. Okay. So in the medical business, we've got clinical folks and we've got administrative folks. There's usually one of each that runs a particular department, and we call that the dyad. So I'm kind of borrowing that medical term here for looking to create a vision where obviously HR leadership reports to operational leadership, that their focus is on money, money, and money. Okay. And that takes the right people at the right time in the right position. There's a scouting element, as you talked about in football. There is a draft, so to speak, but there's also a developmental piece for a player after they've been hired. If you look at a guy like, who was that running back for the Cowboys? What was short, stocky guy? What was his name? He's the NFL yardage leader.
Emmitt Smith.
Emmitt Smith. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you look at Emmitt Smith's the first 5 years of his career, he was just average. He was, he was a little better than average, but he was certainly not a star. He wasn't the face.
Right.
He wasn't the face of the league, but he had a good work ethic. He had good coaching, and ultimately that led into some longevity, and he became the NFL yardage leader of all time. So what are we doing in organizations to attract the right talent? And then what are we doing to keep the right talent and then to help talent develop? So I got a couple quotes here for the week. I'll let you respond to each of those.
Let me comment real quickly on your Emmitt Smith analogy.
Okay.
I've been a longtime Cowboy fan. I know that's painful. I know. It's painful. That's what keeps me humble. All right. They haven't won a championship in 30 years. I get it. All right. But during the Emmitt Smith glory days, and I'm glad you brought that up because you're right on the money. Emmitt Smith, when he was drafted, and like you said, the first 5 years was a good running back, but no one thought he was going to be the league leading rusher, right? Well, talk about HR. HR for the Dallas Cowboys invested in an offensive line that was called the Great Wall of Dallas. The average weight of those offensive line was over 300 pounds, and all of them made All-Pro at least a couple of times. And why Emmitt Smith, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why he made so many yards is that he wasn't touched by anybody for the first 5 yards. The holes that they blew open in the defense gave him a 5-yard, but essentially that's one of the reasons why the connection to HR is so important. You can't win with one person. One superstar doesn't do it. You have to build a supporting cast around them.
So my analogy around Emmitt Smith, which I just kind of thought of as I was sitting here, it meant something to you because you saw that happen as a Cowboy fan. Nice. So I was a Redskin fan. Can you hear me?
Ooh, boo.
I was a Redskin fan. In fact, Joe Gibbs and I went and met with Roger Staubach and Tom Landry in '86 to talk about his youth home, Youth for Tomorrow. Paul Anderson was a weightlifter, strongest man in the world back in the day. He was from Dallas, and he had started these Paul Anderson youth homes, which grew into Youth for Tomorrow. And so Staubach and Landry and Gibbs were best buddies off the field. Yet the competition between the Cowboys and Indians goes back 200 years. So very interesting. Okay, couple quotes for the day. Thought for the day. I got 2 of them. Okay. So the first one is by Doug Conant, Conant, Doug Conant. And he says, to win in the marketplace, you must first win in the workplace. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Well, I think that really has to know your own organization, know what your core values are, know what your primary delivery is. And once you understand that, then you can start competing in the marketplace. But I think if you're not sure of what it is, you're not confident of what you deliver, it's going to be very hard to find that footing. And the analogy I like to use for that is if you don't know where you are, any path will take you there, someplace else, right? If you don't know what your start point is, if you aren't grounded on something, how do you make adjustments? I know a lot of times doing land navigation, one of the most important things is to know where you are on the map. Because if you can't identify the terrain feature or the location where you are, whatever azimuth you take off on is going to take you someplace, but it's not going to take you where you want to be. So I think that's a great quote.
You've been reading this?
Once, at least.
So I talk about if you want to get to your future state, you got to know your current state, and as we were traveling through Toyota with the Ford executives, they were really in bad shape. And the team leader, the young team leader was running around at Toyota. Whistles are going off, bells are going off, sounds are going off. The line stopped. And the Ford executive said, you guys are really messed up today. And the kid goes, yeah, but at least we know it, And that's what he was saying. He was saying, "Oh, if I know my current state, I'm not, you know, rose-colored stained glass windows. I mean, I'm looking at reality.
Right.
That allows me to set my expectations from my current baseline." So that was a
And, and
good
just,
point.
to contrast that with, the famous saying by Yogi Berra, when you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Very good. Very good. Okay, the next one. This is interesting. Jim Collins, good to great guy. He says, people are not your most important asset. The right people are. Okay. So how many organizations today have educated people, smart people, engineer trained, STEM, STE trained, okay, but they're just doing a mediocre job, and we're spending all that kind of money on those folks, and they're just not doing the job. So the HR portion in the stamp of approval says that we have to be more than about payroll and benefits, that there should be a dyad, a relationship. That's my challenge, is there should be a close relationship between all support functions, but we'll stick to HR here with operational leadership. So certainly the chains of command should report to the CEO.
First of all, I love that analogy and I love that discussion because it also goes back to, and you touched on it a bit, and that is, what are you measuring? What are you measuring for performance? For example, if HR comes in and says, we are over the top good. We had 60 classes last week. We had 35 people finish the computer-based training. We had all these videos that were watched. And the operation guy says, well, what difference did that make to our output? What difference did that make to our production? You're measuring the wrong things. If you're just measuring numbers of people who do things and it has no impact on improvement on the operation, then you're clearly not bringing the right people in or measuring the right things.
So here's a challenge. Okay. If we want to move HR to be more operationally focused, I say we pull them out and put them in operations for 6 months.
Yeah, that's a task organization is what that is. You have and a lot of companies actually do that, Tim. It's called a shadow HR. For example, in the military, they used to have your own HR rep in the battalion area or the company area because you couldn't count on the one at your higher headquarters to do the right thing. So you designated one of your folks, took it out of Hyde, right, to do the HR function. So they had this shadow organization because they weren't being well represented or cared for at the higher levels. So that's the integration that they did as a workaround. But what if it was by design? What if it was, let's put a coded position in these organizations that is your HR rep. And yes, they still have to answer to higher headquarters, but they're your first point of contact for HR issues. I think you're much more responsive.
So I'm a CEO and I get a new HR guy. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, glad you're here. I like your resume. We're excited about you. But do you know my 3 priorities? Okay, that'd be the first question. And then I would say, I'm going to put you in as a superintendent for 6 months. You're going to run production or whatever the business that you're in for 6 months. You can take notes and you can check in with your HR leadership, on Fridays, but Monday through Thursday, you're going to be doing operations because you got to walk in their moccasins. You got to understand the voice of the customer. You got to understand what our priorities are. And I'm sure some HR managers are going to go, I don't want to do that, but it's only 6 months, and you're going to learn some invaluable lessons. And who do you think would step up and do that? I think Jack Welch would have done something like that.
Yeah, that's a great concept. And like I said, if you normalize that, as opposed to making it just by the few that have that good idea, but if it's more of a normal process that if you're going to work HR, you need to understand the operations.
At Ford Motor Company, there was a group called HIPOs, HI-PO, and those were the high potentials. Okay, those were the ones that were destined for leadership positions. Well, they would put them in 6-month stints in all areas just for them to get exposure to the whole business. When I was at the Lorain assembly plant, all manufacturing directors had to go through the Lorain assembly plant if they wanted to become a manufacturing director because the relationship with the union was pretty. So let's talk about the train model. The R section in the CEO stamp of approval, it's a system for developing people and for sustaining organizations. So the train model is looking at helping the individual, but it's also looking to help those 3 things that the CEO focuses on. So a key question here is, what does every employee need to become successful? That's what the train model asks. What do we need to do? What do we need to give? What do we need to support the employee to help them be successful? And then as they relate to others, there's this force multiplication effect. So that's kind of the focus of the train model. Every employee needs direction before development. So we want to start out by telling and teaching them what the expectations are. So that's the first step in the train model. Tell, teach, give direction, give clarity, give roles and responsibilities, give table of organizations, help people know where they fit and what they bring to the table. They need clarity, they need direction. Next is the review stage, okay? And that's where you say, "Hey, remember in orientation onboarding we talked about how you handle this situation? Well, we're now in that situation. So let's review how you just handled it. Could you have done things differently? Remember in orientation we talked about doing A, B, and C. Well, you did C, B, and D this time. That didn't work out too good. So you review with them what you taught them. So in adult education, the step one is cognitive dumping, basically. You're just opening their head up and telling them what the expectations are. Now that they've been here 3 to 6 months and they're out running the floor, they're doing their jobs, as the supervisor is with them, they shadow with them, and then you say, "Hey, this is a situation we talked about on onboarding. Did a great job handling that. So good job. Keep that up." So that's kind of the second phase in the train model. And then third, there are times when people just need assistance. Okay. They know how to do their jobs, and you just basically say as an HR rep, you're doing a good job. What do you need? How can I assist you? Do you need further training? Do you need a new certification? Do you need another step in your development in order to get to your next promotion? And then fourthly, we involve people in opportunities to have greater responsibility. And oftentimes people, have to have responsibility to show responsibility, have to be given a trial or a test to do that. And then ultimately in the development of the individual, we want to nominate them for promotion. We want to nominate their projects for greater influence. So at the beginning, it's kind of direct. We teach them, we tell them what the expectations are. After 3 to 6 months, we start to review, this is what we said, good job here, tweak it a little bit on that side. And then once they move past that point, we basically just check in. HR just checks in and says, "How can I help you? What do you need?" And then as they start to think about getting promoted or growing in their development, we're going to involve them in opportunities to show responsibility. And then ultimately we're going to nominate. So how does that sound with the logic smell test, JD?
Well, first of all, I think it is logical. And if you think about any time, and I know as I reflect on my times in leadership, while I didn't have the actual train acronym to go through like you just did, I can relate to every single one of those of being critical in the development of the individual that was coming on to the team. The one that I think gets missed the most is the last one. I think a lot of organizations do a pretty good job of explaining what their job is, what they want for performance, but the reward or the compensation or the recognition for doing that is often lacking. I found that while it's easy to do those first ones because it's pretty standard practice in most good organizations, senior leaders miss the opportunity to reward good performance. And I will tell you that it doesn't have to be money, it just is recognition. Being recognized by a senior leader in front of your peers for some top performance goes a long way, both at the personal level, but also it spreads out to the people that witnessed it. This leader obviously cares. This leader has picked the right metrics to determine that this person did a great job, and they're recognizing him. So I think the first ones are probably more common. It's that last one I think a lot of people miss.
So think about it this way. Employees need direction. They need information. They need help. They need opportunity, and then they need support. Okay. So when we tell and teach, we provide direction. When we review, we give them information that they need. When we assist, we give them the help that they need. And then when we involve them, we give them opportunity to improve. And then when we nominate them, we give them greater influence. So if you think about employee development, it's a pretty logical step. And I think it's the skeleton, the bones of what HR should really be doing. And then when you partner that with leadership, senior executive expectations, what a powerful combination HR and operational leadership can
Yeah.
provide.
Well, I think the second most often neglected or missed is the involve. And that's when there's a problem that's being solved, and the big brains in the organization go into the back room and they come out with a solution. And the people that are going to be impacted that solution were never asked, never consulted, never even brought into the problem solving sequence. And they are now saddled with a solution that doesn't work because they didn't ask. I've found that two things happen when I ask those people that are going to be impacted. First, I start to understand better what they do. Because I don't know what everybody's individual job is, but when I tell them this is what we're trying to solve for, how does this impact you? They first tell me what their impact is. And then the second piece that I get by doing the impacted individuals is I usually end up with a better solution. It's because they work it day in and day out. I mean, when you go to for your example in the auto industry, if someone in the back room came up with a solution on the assembly line and didn't involve anybody that was actually on the assembly line, and then they just rolled it out, number one, it would be met with complete resistance because they're going, what? Why are we doing it like this? This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life, right? Again, it's a simple thing to do is saying, hey, this is what we're trying to fix. What are your thoughts on this? And the second and third order effects of that is that person walks away saying, I've been working for this company for 10 years. This is the first time somebody ever asked me my opinion. And that goes a long way too.
It's exponential. If somebody feels like their voice is being heard, and they have 20, 30 years experience and a senior leader says, hey, what do you think?
Exactly.
Wow, what a motivating factor that is. And if you couple that with the adherence to standards, okay, where that standard is the baseline for improvement, you then can say to people, hey, we want to follow the standard, but if you can make it better, it'll become the new standard and you'll get recognized for making the new standard. It'll be JD's standard, and that's definitely a motivating factor. Okay, so for the next 5 weeks, we're going to spend a week on the tell teach mode. We're going to spend a week on the review mode. We're going to spend a week on assisting and then involving and then nominating folks for promotion. I think next week we're going to have Rennie. She runs Kids International, and we're going to be talking about the importance of giving direction to your team members. So any final thoughts on this inaugural kickoff of the new Proxis booth?
Well, I'm looking forward to it because I really like the logical flow. And I know that's a snappy acronym that you have there that we can follow. But when you think about it, as you were walking through what happens at each one of those, it really does make sense. And it's things that I can relate to. Is like, I may not have done them all right all the time, but I have this acronym helps me to understand where I should be focusing. So I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So what are you doing next week, JD?
Same thing we do every week, Tim. Tell us about it. What is it?
Bridging leadership theory with operational reality. So we're going to try to take over the business world and try to help make things better for folks. So first Proxis booth, inaugural kickoff podcast, full of technical difficulties, but we are flexible and we work through it. And we'll just see how good of an editor I am as I get this thing released. All right. Well, thank you. We'll talk later this week.
Other than the technical difficulties, I enjoyed this session because I really do see the applicability of what we're talking about right now. And like I said, I didn't have the value that this brings by having a nice acronym to remember, but I can relate to each one of the topics as you describe them.
Support the mission. Align your team. Build capability. Leverage Teaming Plus for alliances. Because performance doesn't happen by accident. This has been JD and the Brain.